So last time we took a look at the geometry that the Assyrian tree of life incorporates. And if we take off the Assyrian tree in the background, this is actually the geometry that they've incorporated. It uses a more complex version of the flower of life, and you can see that what is being colored in right here that moves around is the same as the outline of the tree that they're using in their relief. The upper Vesica Pisces is associated with the head, and what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at the human body on top of the Assyrian tree of life. We've already taken a look at some of the geometry. There is one more piece of geometry I wanted to show you really quick I thought you might be interested in seeing, and it's how they incorporated phi, or the golden ratio, into this as well. So if we take a look at this thing right here, and if we use the winged disk as the center of our vortex, and the very bottom of this thing as the extension of the golden spiral, we'll see something really interesting here. So if I stretch this golden rectangle out and use this area right here as the center, what you're going to notice is that the top of the wings to the bottom of the tail feathers covers this area that you see right here. And if you back out again, the rest of it, this line to this line down here, you can see how those fit right in there, and so they have also incorporated the golden spiral into this as well. But this is also the same as what we would see if we were to paste the human body on top of this as well. The human body from the sacrum to this area here, and then from there to what we see as far as the line that goes across here would be the very top of the brain. So I thought you might be interested in seeing how the golden spiral is incorporated into this drawing, or this relief right here. So now let's take a look at the human body, and I want to show you some very interesting things about it and associated to the relief. First of all, we'll take off the relief itself, and let's just take a look at the human body. And I want you to take a look down here at the bottom where the sacrum is. So the sacrum comes down and it ends right here, basically, behind this bone that you see right here. But what I want you to notice is that you have two holes, one here and one here. This is actually an MRI of a person that you see right here. So I like to use these MRIs because it shows us something that we know is going to be accurate, and as far as the human body goes. But there's a very big clue that we get right here when we take a look at this versus the tree of life on the Assyrian tree. We've already seen the Kabbalah tree of life. We know that the Kabbalah tree of life, that this area right here that you see is associated to the bottom of the sacrum. This area is associated to the heart and the center, and this area is associated to the pineal gland. We've already seen this on top of the flower of life, so we've already seen the geometry, and we see how they've incorporated the flower of life into their relief. But now, let's take a look at the human body according to what we see on it versus the relief. So, if we take off the tree of life here, and we're looking at just the body, these two holes that I'm showing you right here, let me turn on the relief, and I want to show you what they have used in order to simulate that. So if we zoom in, if you see these two holes right here, one here and one here, and if you see this dip that goes right here, this dip, this would be where the start of the sacrum is, right here. So it's right around in here is where the start of the sacrum is. Now, if you were to take this human body, for example, and say we were to back out, and just to show you real quick, I'm not gonna really move this thing, but if we were to say shrink it, now remember when I shrink this, everything is remaining as far as the body goes. I'm not stretching it or anything. I'm just shrinking it, so all the aspect ratio is the same. But what happens when I do that? Well, what happens when I do that, if I actually move the body down here, you'll notice that those two holes, for example, are now too close together. So we know that we're on the money because if we stretch the body out such that the bottom is of this thing where the sacrum is where we said it was going to be, the center is where the heart is going to be, and this area is where the pineal gland is going to be, then we know that the holes are going to be right. That's the reason why they're separated the correct distance from each other. So this is what I wanted to show you right down here that gives us a very big clue that we're actually looking at the sacrum area. The next thing I wanted to show you is I was telling you about how they hold things at certain levels. You see this staff that he's holding right here? That staff is at the same level as the heart. That red thing that you see back there is the heart. And up here we have the head. And of course, if you notice, the cranium is just, or the skull is just a little bit bigger than what we see as the disc, and the disc is actually about the same size as the brain itself. You can kind of see the brain inside there, and the brain is a little bit smaller than what we see as the skull. And the disc is a little bit smaller than what we see as the skull as well. Now here's something else that's really interesting about this. If we take the Assyrian relief, if you notice these lines that move around here and here, if we follow the inside track of those, they come up into a point. You notice they look a certain way. Now if we take that off, you'll notice that that covers the same area as what we see as the inside of the rib cage area that moves around. Let me turn that on for you again, and you can see that covers the same area. So we're dealing with the same thing, as well as the neck area that comes up that we see right here is also covered. So this area right here that we see on their tree of life is associated to the lungs. Before we move on, let's take a look at the flower of life and show you where they are placing things. So if you notice where the staff is located, it's located right in the very center. So is the heart. So we have the sacrum area, we have the heart, and the staff is pointing right at the heart. Then we come up, and at the very end of the tree of life, that's where we have the neck area that starts. And then the head, the actual place of the where the spinal cord or the spinal column connects to the skull and enters the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the bottom of the skull. That's actually located right where this disc starts. So if you were to take, just say for example, the backbone and the pelvis area, and you were to not use anything else, that would extend from the sacrum area all the way up just to the very bottom. It would be holding this disc up, and that disc would be everything located from the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the bottom of the skull, to the top of the skull. So it would be the area that contains the brain. Okay, there's one last important piece I wanted to show you regarding the geometry of the Assyrian Tree of Life, and this is an association with a relief that we see in the Temple of Luxor. Now, the Temple of Luxor is the temple that R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch studied for a long time and found to be representative of the human body. These temples are found all over the place that represent the human body. But here's the very interesting thing about this particular temple. Now, these reliefs are not small. These are just as tall as you and I standing up. They're very large, and they're carved into granite and stone. And what we find is that just like we find in these other interesting things in ancient history, for example, the way that they created everything, it looked like they used machining tools, and it looks like that the rocks are the stones that fit together inside the area of the pyramid, that they fit together just perfectly. You can't even slide a razor blade in between the rocks, that they fit so perfectly. We see these types of things around the world. Well, there's another very interesting piece of this puzzle. This particular relief that you see, this Assyrian relief, this was not done in the same area as we see the Temple of Luxor. But there's something really interesting about this thing, and that makes it, kind of connects it to the whole idea of the Temple of Man, or the idea that what we see in Luxor, which represents man, is also tied to this Assyrian tree of life, which represents man. So let me take off the body scan here real quick. And I'm going to turn on something that we can see in Egypt. I'm just going to increase the opacity for you a little bit. And this relief is found on the Temple of Luxor in Egypt. Now, at first glance, you say, well, yeah, that looks similar. But I want to show you something that I believe you'll find very interesting. Back this down to, say, 60%. Okay, now let's take a look at the Assyrian tree right here, and I want you to notice something really interesting about this particular relief. The people on either side of this tree, if you can notice, they're both facing towards the tree. And what you'll also notice about them with a little bit of careful study is, if you look at this guy right here, his eye, for example, if we draw a complete rectangle over to the other side, his eye is higher than the guy on the right. If we draw a rectangle from this guy's eye on the right to the guy on the left, you can see that the guy on the right is shorter than the guy on the left. You can also test this by moving up to the very top of the screen and just taking a look. If we put his eye right at the very top of the screen, you'll see that his eye is higher than this guy's right here. Now, if we take a look at the one from the Egyptian, you'll see that this guy's eye sits at the border of the screen, and it's also higher than this guy. This guy right here is taller than this guy. And if you also notice the width of what you see above this right here is the same width as what we see as far as the winged disc goes that we see right here. So with closer inspection, what we can see is, we say zoom in, say to 100%, we can see that these guys are computer precision overlays. The only thing that's changed, other than the only thing that's really changed is the theme. Instead of the winged disc, we see something else. We still have a tree. We take a look at the Egyptian version. We still have a tree, and we still see the representation of a pelvis down here below. Where they're tying the node right here is the same as the node that we see right here on the Assyrian tree. The area where they have the platform is the same area as the top of the Assyrian tree that we see right here. This area right here represents water, so it represents the area where the neck is, or the body is about to connect to the skull. And then we see this area up here in the Egyptian version, which is representative of the winged disc that we see on the Assyrian tree. But these guys are both facing the tree, and we can even zoom down to, or zoom in to, say, 150%. And what we'll see is that even the structure of the nose, the eye placement, and everything is the same as what we see on the Assyrian tree. If we go over here and check this guy, it's the same. And so what this tells us is something really important. It tells us that they were using some kind of a template, but it also shows us that what they were doing was with some type of strange computer precision type accuracy, because these are not small. These are very large, and they are carved into stone and granite, and they are in completely different places. Luxor, the Temple of Luxor, is not anywhere close to where the Assyrian Tree of Life reliefs were done. So it gives us something very interesting. But the similarities is that they're both trees, they're both showing the same theme of what is going on, and the geometry and their placement is almost exactly the same. I mean, if not exactly the same. And so this gives us an idea, because the Temple of Luxor, based on the framework of man, we can see is also associated to what we see with the Assyrian Tree of Life, which is also the framework of man. Okay, so now let's take a look at the winged disc. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some similarities in symbolism, and we're going to reference something from R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch in the Temple of Man, or the Temple in Man, which is his book that he wrote when he studied the Temple of Luxor in Egypt. So this is his book, The Temple in Man, and what he studied was this particular temple. And what he found is that when he moved from room to room after studying the geometry of the temple, he noticed that the hieroglyphs on the walls were actually referencing things associated to those areas of the body which he has placed on top of this thing. So what we see in history is that many of these temples, in fact just about all of them that we see, were always associated to the human body. The reason why is because the human body, if we take a look, for example, in the Bible, it says man is made in God's image. So when they designed a temple and made it like man because it was more representative of God, since man was made in God's image. And we see this all over history. We see it in the Gothic cathedrals as well. What I wanted to show you about the winged disc, or the head area, is actually on page 51, and then I'll show you some symbolism associated with it. And he says here, it is interesting to find this organ contained in an external bony framework, like the carapace of an insect. This characteristic, like the sutures of the skull and the entire shape thus formed by the crown of the skull, could be compared with the image of the scarab, a theme treated in Egypt especially under Thutmose III and Menaphos III, the builders of the Temple of Luxor. The builders of the Temple of Luxor. Now what he's showing here is a very crude example, which I'll show you a better example of here in just a second. This is what he's actually trying to show you. He's trying to show you the scarab beetle versus the skull. This is actually an image of the top of a skull, and you can see the sutures, and what is the same as we see between the human skull and the scarab beetle. Now this is significant, because what we actually also see in Egypt is we see this particular image right here, and this image that we see right here is the winged scarab, and the winged scarab would be the same as a winged skull. So when we take a look at the Assyrian Tree of Life, we also see the winged skull in comparison to the winged scarab. Also take a look at Hermes Trismegistus there on the left. He's holding a staff with wings at the very top of it, which is the staff of wisdom, and we see the serpent, which represents Kundalini moving up the staff. You see that his head is actually winged, which is the winged globe, which is another association that we see, or similarity that we see in history, showing us that these are the same. These are various winged discs that we see in history. Here's Egypt. If you notice these, what they call streamers coming off each one of these, here is a winged scarab, and you can see the similarity there. This is Farabahar from Iran. You can see it's a winged disc. These are all winged solar discs. You can see the streamers there. This is a winged disc associated with Assur or Osiris, and we know Osiris is the same as Marduk, and we have the winged disc sitting on top of the Assyrian Tree of Life. Here's another one, Sumerian with the streamers, the same thing. And then here we have an ancient Sumerian seal. It shows the 3 stars of Orion, and we can see the winged disk right here. And what do we have right here is we have the Orion Nebula. And the Orion Nebula is the representation of a star. It is the representation of what we were looking at when we saw the Tree of Life. That solar disk at the very top was not our local sun. Our local sun represents the heart. What represents the brain is outside of our solar system, and that represents the spiritual sun, which is located in the Orion Nebula area. And we take a look at this as far as thunderbolts.info. This is exactly the way things are created. If you take a look in Kabbalah, you can see that if we take a look at the Tree of Life, we have up here, we have the Orion Nebula, which represents Orion. It represents the brain, the solar disk that we have at the very top. And what it's mentioned in Kabbalah and many of the other ancient texts is that all the planets and the sun were created by means of a lightning flash. And that's why when you take a look at the Tree of Life, a lot of times you'll see it lit up so that it looks like a zigzag, moving all the way down the tree and then finally reaching Earth. That zigzag is to represent the electrical flow, the lightning that created everything from a lightning flash all the way down to Earth. So this Tree of Life gives us all kinds of information by looking at it. And so we know that this winged disk up here is also associated to the Orion Nebula, because the Orion Nebula absolutely gives us the image of the winged disk itself. So not only do we get the textual references, but we also get the image references as well. This right here is the winged sun that you've always seen that sits on top of the Tree of Life. This is the one that we see all over the place. It's referring to Asar, which is Osiris, and we know from Pyramid Text Utterance 442 that Osiris has come as Orion. We also know that when people died, they believed they became stars in the kingdom of Osiris inside Orion, and the kingdom of Osiris is that same one that we see mentioned everywhere. The one that sits in the middle of the 7 candlesticks. This is the Son of Man, and this is the same as what we see as the winged disk. It's not the actual sun in the sky with brightness around it causing the appearance of a winged disk. It's actually the image of a winged disk that we see inside the Orion Nebula, and that's located exactly in the same area as the trapezium. The trapezium of the Orion Nebula, when looked at it in the visual spectrum, is a triangle, and that triangle has the same slopes as the pyramid at 51 degrees. And we know that the other symbol for Osiris, which we read from E.A. Wallace Budge, is a tent with an eye in it, which is the same as an eye in a triangle. So in the visual spectrum, we have Osiris, and we also have Osiris in the winged disk form, both located in the same area, both located in Orion. And if we take a look at the geometry associated with the winged disk that you see right here, the same geometry that is incorporated in the winged disk above the Assyrian Tree of Life, at which point they had perfected their geometry, is the same geometry that we actually see inside the Orion Nebula itself. The diamond shape that you see right here covering this area is the same diamond shape that we see right here as we do the transition all the way into the area which is the center of the very center of the Orion Nebula, where NASA believes there to be a black hole there, or thunderbolts.info believes there to be a plasmoid. Whatever you want to call it, it is some kind of a vortex, and this is something I discovered a year before NASA did. So this is actually your winged disk that you see all over the place. And just like the seal that I showed you from the ancient Sumerian seal where they show the 3 stars of Orion, they also show the location of the winged disk, and that is the Orion Nebula. So remember, when we're looking at the Assyrian Tree of Life, this up here represents the cosmic sun, or the solar disk. This is not the same as our sun. Our sun, which you see right here, which is beauty, that represents the sun in our solar system. That's our local sun. So as you can see, the Kabbalah tree of life is both a macrocosm and a microcosm, both having a similarity as far as man is concerned. The very top here that we see related to the head area is the winged disc. Now there's another piece of this that we can confirm that also shows that this is Osiris. Remember, if you're going to become a star in Orion, in the kingdom of Osiris, the best place to become a star in Orion, or the most logical place, would be a place where stars are born, and that would actually be inside the Orion Nebula. But to confirm this even more that we see, we have the scarab beetle shaped like a skull. It's a winged scarab beetle. You can see that the backbone coming all the way up here and reaching the winged disc is the same as what we see as Hermes' staff. Hermes is wearing wings on his head, which shows that his head is a winged globe. All this points to the fact that this represents the head area. But on top of that, we have one more thing we can take a look at. When we go into the later art inside the cathedrals, Michelangelo painted the Orion Nebula. But what did he also paint? He painted a brain. Because this is the brain of the macrocosmic system. It is the Orion Nebula. And we can see that he painted a brain, and I've broken this down into detail for you in other videos, that these areas correspond: the fornix, the corpus callosum, the different folds in the brain like the cingulate gyrus and these types of things. We know that he painted a brain, and we've already confirmed there is no dispute. There has been no dispute at all, and we can easily provable that he painted the Orion Nebula. And if we take a look at close-up images, how he did this, we have no idea, because he did this 100 years before the first telescope, but he painted the Orion Nebula. So he painted both a brain and he painted the Orion Nebula. So when we come back here to our macrocosmic system, we know that the Orion Nebula contains a winged disk in the middle of it. We know that it is associated to the brain. We see it from Michelangelo's drawing. We know that these winged discs are associated with Asar and Osiris is associated with Orion. So when you put all the pieces together of this puzzle, you can see that the macrocosmic system, the brain of the system, is the Orion Nebula. The heart of the system is the sun. So the sun receives power. It receives power from the brain and then pulses out to all of the planets in our solar system. And this is also confirmed by thunderbolts because stars are created in cosmic filaments called Birkeland currents. And then our sun, in turn, charges the rest of the planets in the solar system. And that's kind of the way that the macrocosmic body works. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and the geometry behind it. I wanted to put the pieces together for you in a different way, but this pretty much shows you what the real meaning of the Assyrian tree of life and many other trees of life that you've seen, including the macrocosmic and microcosmic versions of the Kabbalah. You can now kind of see a little bit better about what they mean. The brain of the system is the Orion Nebula, and it is what we could consider the firstborn of the infinite. It is the firstborn because from there all the other things were created. So it came into existence first into the material world, which represents the pineal gland of the system, and then it created Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the southern sky that we see in the Bible. It created the different planets, and all of this because it is the atom cadmon, or the brain of the system, and it creates everything from its lightning flashes. We see this in all of the ancient texts. So I hope you enjoy that. You guys take care, and now you can see that Ancient Aliens is not exactly forthcoming about their information.